All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating, a deep dive into the potential role of a systemic design lab and how it could play a part in actually, shifting how systems work.
Absolutely.
Think of this as your shortcut to getting up to speed on this whole idea.
Exactly. And I think what we're sharing with you is peeking into the really early conversations of two people trying to make sense of this whole thing, right? And so you're basically listening in on the very first thoughts as they move from just being like, oh, labs are interesting to like, okay, wait, what could a design lab actually do in this space?
Yeah.
What would be the tangible, outputs or outcomes of this lab?
And that's the core tension, right? How do you create a lab that isn't just a replica of every other lab that's out there? How can it really get to those deeper levels of change, those inner workings, the structures, particularly through the lens of a systemic design, right?
Yeah.
So it's one thing to talk about it in theory, but actually making it happen.
Absolutely.
So that's really what we're looking at here.
So our mission, if you will, in this deep dive is to unpack those initial sparks of this idea.
Okay.
And to really understand those very first questions and that core thinking behind why a systemic design lab that focuses on how systems change might be needed and what unique value it could bring to the table.
So where did this even begin? Where did they even start with this?
It started with, I think, just a shared interest in understanding what labs are and what they do.
Okay.
And of course, this wasn't in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Right. This was based on previous learnings, previous experiences that both these individuals brought to the conversation.
Yeah.
But what I think is quite interesting is how quickly that initial kind of broad curiosity transitioned into a much more practical focus.
Yeah.
They started asking, like, what's the basic concept of a lab?
Right.
And then it went to, okay, what specific role could a design lab play? So it was moving away from understanding the theory of labs to really thinking about, like, okay, how can we apply this in the real world?
And with that practical turn came some pretty fundamental questions.
Absolutely.
Like, what is this thing? Like, we're calling it a systemic design lab, but what is it?
Yeah.
And probably even more importantly, like, what is it for? Like, what problem is it trying to solve? What change is it trying to bring about?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think this is where you can start to understand their thinking. They recognized the inherent challenge here, that it would be so easy to fall into creating something that was just another version of what already exists.
Totally.
Right? And so that tension between wanting real world impact and needing to break away from old ways of doing things is something that is really present throughout the conversation.
They explicitly mention how easy it would be to default to the familiar, quote unquote, real world lab model.
Exactly.
I mean, we all have a certain picture in our mind of what a lab is, right? So what would make this what would make this systemic design lab have its own, unique angle?
And I think the difference they were looking for wasn't just about creating new products or services, right? They were looking at these inner and structural dimensions.
Right.
The things that actually drive how systems behave and how they evolve.
Right.
And this is where the whole concept of systemic design comes into play.
Okay.
And for anyone listening who maybe isn't familiar with systemic design, think of it as an approach that looks at the entire web of interconnected parts within a system rather than just focusing on one or two elements in isolation.
So it's not just tweaking, a product or a thing, but how to affect the underlying dynamics, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, but venturing into this territory raises a lot of questions.
For sure.
Particularly, we don't have a blueprint for setting up and running this kind of lab.
Right.
It's not like you can go and...
There's no playbook.
Yeah, there's no playbook. You can just go download this playbook for how to do this. And they talk about embodied practices and the need to discover something new.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also the very practical question of how do you connect the day-to-day work of a lab to those really big long-term goals?
Right.
What people call Horizon 3, right?
Yeah.
Like Horizon 1 is your immediate tasks. Horizon 2 is maybe your, medium-term project. But Horizon 3 is that far off.
That big vision.
Yeah, that big vision, that transformative horizon.
Absolutely. And building on that, they started to really unpack what defines a systemic design lab.
Okay.
And the emphasis here was very clear. It's not about rebranding something familiar.
Right.
It's not just taking a lab model and slapping on a new label of systemic design.
Right.
They specifically moved away from thinking about a physical location as the defining characteristic.
Right. It's not about the interior design.
Yeah, not about the cool furniture or the layout.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But instead, they started to focus on what are the processes and the thought exercises that would actually make it a lab in this new systemic sense.
And I think it's important to note that they didn't expect to have an answer immediately.
Yeah.
They saw defining this kind of lab as an ongoing journey of exploration rather than trying to, come up with a rigid definition right at the beginning.
Yeah, it's about the process of discovery itself.
Yeah, and this need to explore this questioning of how we've always done things comes from a pretty core belief that the linear cause and effect models that we've relied on in the past just aren't equipped to handle the complex challenges that we're facing.
I think we're seeing this play out all around us.
Yeah.
And there's a growing recognition that we need fundamentally new ways to tackle these complex problems.
Right.
Just tweaking the old systems a little bit isn't going to cut it anymore.
Yeah, we need something different at a deeper level.
Totally.
And this is where those big words like design, but design with a systemic perspective, regeneration, resilience, a holistic worldview becomes so important.
Absolutely.
Because these aren't just trendy terms. They represent a pretty fundamental shift in how we see and interact with the world.
And this sense of urgency that I think you can hear in their conversation is linked to, the global crises that we're all grappling with right now, systemic breakdowns, climate change, all of these environmental and social issues that are interconnected.
Yeah.
And so it's not just an abstract intellectual exercise.
Right.
There's a real sense of responsibility to find ways to address these pretty profound challenges.
But they're also careful to say that it can't just be a playground.
Exactly.
That this lab shouldn't just be...
It can't be a free-for-all.
Yeah.
It needs to be a balance between experimentation and the seriousness of these global issues that we're facing. And to me, that speaks to finding ways to encourage meaningful change without resorting to these simplistic quick fixes or knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah, and to avoid just sort of activating existing methodologies that may have in fact contributed to the problems we're now facing.
We don't want to just keep doing the same things over and over again.
Right. And to see this as a collective learning process.
Absolutely. Where everyone is open to new ways of working and new ideas.
So how do you even design for a world that's inherently nonlinear, right? Where cause and effect isn't always so straightforward.
Right.
They really challenge the traditional idea of design as something with a clear starting point, a defined outcome, and a predictable path to get there.
And I think what's really insightful here is this call to fundamentally rethink what design even means.
Yeah.
Right. To move away from that very linear mindset.
Right.
And instead focus on creating conditions within a system that allow new possibilities to emerge.
Right. So setting the stage.
Exactly.
Rather than trying to write the entire play in advance.
Yeah, they bring up a really crucial point, which is that we all have our own biases and limitations.
Totally.
And we all have our own way of seeing the world.
Right.
And that inevitably shapes how we approach design.
Right.
And so any attempt to create something genuinely new is always going to be informed by our existing perspectives.
Right.
And I think this demands a more humble approach to design.
Yeah.
Recognizing that the system itself plays a much bigger role than the individual designer.
Right.
So it's moving away from that kind of top-down, expert-driven model to something that's much more participatory and allows for the unexpected to arise.
Which creates a tension, right? Between the need to act and guide change and the need to step back and allow the system to evolve in its own way.
So how do you balance that? How do you balance that agency with allowing for things to emerge that you can't fully control?
Yeah. And despite this focus on nonlinearity and emergence, they do start to think about ways to understand if things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
Concepts like circularity become important.
Totally.
The idea that, things are flowing and feeding back into the system. Mm-hmm. They even use the metaphor of an adaptive wave, suggesting that, systems go through these cycles and changes.
Right.
So being aware of the system's current state becomes key.
Absolutely.
And this focus on designing for circular processes rather than just circular outcomes really emphasizes that this is an ongoing thing.
It's a process.
Yeah.
It's not a one-time fix.
It's not a one and done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this naturally leads to the importance of collaboration, right? They realize that big systemic change isn't something that a single person or a single lab can achieve in isolation.
Right.
It's about creating the conditions for people with different skills and perspectives.
Yeah.
To come together and to share their knowledge and to collectively discover new ways forward.
Right.
And the lab, in this sense, really becomes a hub for that kind of collaboration.
So building on this idea of non-linearity, they acknowledge that when you start trying to shift complex systems, things can get a bit fuzzy.
It gets messy.
Yeah.
It gets blurry.
Yeah, it's not always clear,
you
know, and there's this sort of excitement about the possibilities, but also uncertainty about the path forward.
A positiveness and a blurriness.
Yeah, exactly. And the key here is learning to be comfortable with that.
Totally.
With that ambiguity.
Yeah.
You know, designing ways that people interact so that they can navigate this uncertainty together.
Right.
It's about building trust and adaptability into the relationships.
Absolutely. And this comfort with the unknown then allows us to think about what they call designing for organic emergence. Right. So it's about creating the right conditions for new things to arise.
Right.
That you couldn't have fully planned or predicted.
Yeah.
Which is such a fundamental shift from the traditional design focus on delivering specific predefined results.
Right, like a checklist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So design in this context really evolves. It's no longer just about creating these tangible objects or specific services, but it becomes more about this ongoing process of shaping conditions that support this continuous adaptation and change within the system.
Right. So the context of where this lab would operate is key.
Absolutely.
Right. It's not meant to be this isolated entity, but something deeply connected to the larger systems that it's trying to influence.
And its main goal is to create the conditions for more systemic and holistic approaches to design to take root and to grow.
And they identified two main ways of approaching design in this context. One, driven by challenges.
Right.
Right. The urgent problems.
Like climate change. That demand our attention.
Yeah.
And the other one focuses on potential.
Okay.
So looking for opportunities and positive tipping points. That could lead to significant change.
So then it raises the question of perspective, right?
Right.
Are we designing from our own viewpoint for a specific group or with all the different stakeholders involved?
With all the voices in this system.
Yeah, and this really highlights the need to be inclusive and co-creative in this process.
And they acknowledge that the journey of systemic change is likely to be, it's not going to be a straight line.
Right.
It's going to have its ups and downs.
It's going to have a bumpy road.
It's going to be a bumpy road.
Yeah.
And they even talk about the potential for crises to arise.
Right.
But instead of viewing those as just negative setbacks, they suggest reframing them as potential catalysts for transformation.
Opportunities for new pathways to open up.
Exactly.
So the lab then becomes a space where these different energies can come together. Yeah. The urgency of the problems and the potential for breakthroughs.
Absolutely.
To encourage discussion and learning,
collective learning,
and a more deliberate way of navigating complexity.
And it's also crucial to remember, as they do, that the history of design isn't perfect.
Right.
A lot of well-intentioned solutions from the past have inadvertently created new problems down the line.
Yeah.
And so this really highlights the need for constant critical thinking and reflection throughout the design process.
So a step-by-step approach with awareness.
With reflection.
And a willingness to adapt as we learn. And a key question they keep coming back to is, can we develop a framework or a process to help us navigate this?
Can we navigate this uncertainty?
Yeah.
And it brings them to this core understanding that designing for transition is a systemic, holistic, and fundamentally nonlinear process of relationships.
Right. So it's not about finding those isolated quick fixes, but about being an active participant in this interconnected web of change.
Totally.
Yeah.
And they highlight the need for what they call other or different kinds of relationships within a system.
Yeah.
Relationships that involve, not just agreement.
Right.
But also productive tension and contradiction and diverse perspectives.
Right. It's about fostering a richer network of interactions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And emergence in this sense is not something you can directly engineer or control.
Right.
But it arises from creating the right conditions.
Right.
The interplay of these different ideas and tensions and perspectives that spark unexpected and innovative possibilities.
And a key part of that is creating an environment where people feel safe enough
Yes.
To step outside their comfort zones.
Absolutely.
To challenge their own assumptions.
Yeah.
And explore new ways of thinking.
That discomfort can be a powerful driver of change.
So this leads us to resilience. And initially they thought of resilience as something that a well-designed system would possess.
Right. So it was an outcome.
Yeah, it was an outcome.
Good design.
Yeah. But their understanding evolved to see resilience as a fundamental mindset.
Totally.
A way of being that allows us to navigate the uncertainty of transition itself.
It's that capacity for continuous learning.
Yeah.
A fundamental openness to the unknown and an acceptance that things won't always go according to plan.
Right. It's a companion on the journey.
Yeah.
Not the destination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the lab's role isn't to achieve resilience as an outcome,
right,
but rather to cultivate resilience.
Okay, to foster it.
To foster it.
Yeah.
Those abilities to learn and adapt and be open to new possibilities.
Within the system.
Within the system.
Yeah, and within the people involved.
Absolutely.
And they also point out that resilience isn't this, simple, one-sided concept.
It's multifaceted.
Yeah, it can be a guide, a North Star, pointing us towards stability.
Towards well-being.
But it can also act as a critical lens.
Yeah.
Prompting us to question whether we're truly adapting in a healthy way or just clinging to old patterns.
It can help us see whether we're actually resilient or just rigid.
Right.
In a way that's not serving us anymore.
And this recognition that resilience is embedded in the system.
Yeah.
At multiple levels, right? From the individual to the community.
To the bioregion.
To the bioregion, yeah.
To the larger environment.
And adaptation needs to happen in different ways. Sometimes it's about fitting in. Sometimes it's about transforming the structures themselves.
Absolutely. So it's both.
Right. It's both hand.
It's both hand. Yeah. And this makes resilience kind of a constant requirement for navigating change.
It's dynamic. It's not just about bouncing back.
Right.
But about having the capacity to fundamentally transform in response to pressures.
Yeah, they make this really important point that the focus on resilience in a lot of mainstream discussions can be too narrow.
Right.
It often emphasizes just withstanding shocks and maintaining the status quo.
Right.
And it might overlook those deeper transformative changes that might be necessary for long-term well-being.
And the scale at which we talk about resilience is important.
Sure do.
Resilience at a personal level, at a community level.
At a bioregional level.
At a bioregional level, yeah, all interconnected.
Yeah, and they even bring up this idea of negative resilience.
Yeah.
Which is the tendency of a system to resist needed change.
Right.
To kind of cling to those old ways of operating.
Yeah.
Even when they're not serving us anymore.
Yeah, and so often, when we hear about resilience, it's about building seawalls.
Right.
It's about diversifying crops. It's about these things that help us preserve what is.
To keep things as they are.
Yeah.
Which may not address the underlying issues.
Right.
And this also highlights the interconnected nature of adaptation and innovation.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not separate things.
Right.
But rather two sides of the same coin working together in response to challenges.
And so the lab has this big role to play in promoting this more complete understanding of resilience that includes this transformative aspect.
And transition, in a way, can be seen as this process that leverages our inner resilience as a stepping stone towards a broader, more fundamental transformation.
So it's an invitation.
It's an invitation.
It's a Trojan horse.
That's a Trojan horse for deeper change.
Yeah, and by focusing on practical examples of resilience, they suggest, how can cities be more resilient?
Mm-hmm.
We can open up pathways to thinking about more profound systemic shifts.
Right, allowing us to widen that lens and move beyond these linear, narrow solutions.
And ultimately, this inner work of developing resilience, this adaptability and this openness is seen as this key factor connected to our capacity to innovate and to change systems. Totally.
So that brings us to regeneration, which initially felt a lot less tangible to them than resilience.
Less concrete.
Yeah. It was harder to picture what it actually meant.
Yeah. And yet regeneration emerged as this crucial North Star.
Okay.
Representing a fundamentally better way of interacting with the world.
Okay.
It's about shifting from a mindset of extraction towards one of renewal and life-giving process.
So at its core, regeneration is about finding ways of operating that aren't extracted.
And hit back.
Yeah, that embed our activities within the natural cycles of replenishing Like our own bodies.
Like our own bodies have this incredible ability to heal and regenerate.
Right.
But how do we bring that into our systems?
The challenge is how to make this tangible.
Totally.
How to make it actionable.
Yeah.
It often feels like a stand-in for a desired future.
Yeah, it's like a placeholder for something that's fundamentally different.
But not fully defined.
Yeah. And achieving regeneration requires this huge shift in perspective.
Yeah.
Moving away from that reductionist, purely mechanical view of the world.
Right.
Toward a more holistic understanding of interconnectedness and interdependence.
So it connects with what they called oldism.
Yeah.
This more ancient worldview.
This holistic view.
That emphasizes the harmony and interconnectedness.
Right.
Of patterns and relationships within a system.
Yeah.
And there's this sense of humility in talking about transitions.
Yes.
Rather than these grand transformations when it comes to regeneration.
We can't just engineer it.
Right.
Regeneration is something that emerges from a system that's functioning in a positive, life-affirming way.
Okay, so it's more a characteristic.
It's a characteristic of a healthy living system.
Than something we can just design.
Exactly.
Think about the regenerative power of nature.
Of nature itself.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So how do we translate that?
But how do we adapt that to human systems?
And I think this is where it gets really tricky.
Yeah.
Because, things like homeostasis, symbiosis, the simple act of creation in nature.
Yeah.
These are all examples of how living systems maintain themselves.
Right.
But they're not so easily translated to our complex social and economic systems.
Right.
But I think the potential lies in finding ways to align our human systems with nature's regenerative principles.
Okay.
So fostering processes of self-repair, self-care, and evolution, where all the interconnected parts contribute to the well-being of the whole.
Right. And this requires this awareness of our place in these larger systems.
At every scale.
At every scale.
Right.
This interconnectedness.
The sense of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
That maybe, an organism understands more intuitively than we do in our complex human creations.
And so regeneration is not something we can directly design and implement, but something we need to sense towards.
To sense toward.
And embed.
And embed aspects of within our processes and our ways of thinking.
So the focus shifts to identifying those critical functions within a system that could nudge it towards more regenerative behavior.
Right, recognizing that ultimately a truly regenerative system sustains and renews itself.
It's not something we have to force.
Right.
Yeah. And it involves designing for awareness, cultivating this deeper sensing of our interconnectedness with the natural world.
And the non-human aspects of our environment.
Yeah. And they talked about creating what they called islands of cohesion within larger systems as a strategy.
Focus on specific areas.
Yeah.
And design processes that over time can nudge the overall system towards more regenerative patterns.
It's about finding those leverage points and designing those processes carefully.
So regeneration is this process of sensing towards a desired state.
Right.
Not a guaranteed off-the-shelf product.
Yeah. And this brings us to a system which they refer to constantly.
Yeah.
And at its most basic, a system is a web of interconnected patterns and relationships.
Not just a collection of parts.
Not just a bunch of pieces.
Right. And they highlighted this kind of almost paradoxical nature of the term.
Yeah.
That almost anything and nothing can be considered a system.
Right.
Which brings with it the danger of trying to design for everything.
Right.
Which of course is impossible.
Which you can't do.
You can't do.
Yeah. And so a systemic viewpoint within the lab emphasizes this interconnectedness with the crucial understanding that the lab itself is a part of, not separate from
have an objective outsider too.
Yeah, the systems that it's trying to influence.
Right.
And so the focus shifts from just the physical structure to the interconnectedness of the process.
Of the interaction.
In the interaction.
And systemic change is really seen as a response to these entanglements.
Yeah, the web of cause and effect.
That complex web of cause and effect.
It's messy.
It's messy.
Yeah.
And the goal isn't to untangle it all.
Right.
Which I think is probably a futile effort.
Right.
But to dance with that entanglement.
Okay, to find ways to work.
To work within it.
Within it.
And through it.
Yeah.
And so the systemic labs become these places or processes where this interconnectedness comes together.
Okay.
And transition is really about finding the pathways through that entanglement.
So systemic thinking requires a different way of seeing the world.
Absolutely.
A different worldview.
where we understand that every action we take has ripple effects.
Right.
That extend far beyond that immediate outcome.
Yeah.
And the complexity of a system
right.
where we can never fully see the whole picture.
Yeah.
Requires us to constantly be sensing what's happening.
Yeah.
And iteratively learning as we go.
Yeah. Which resonates with indigenous wisdom.
Totally.
Like this idea of presence, being attuned to your surroundings.
To the interconnectedness of it all.
Yeah.
And it also requires us to consider not just the immediate effects of our actions.
Right.
But also the second and third and fourth order consequences.
Right.
The longer term and often unintended outcomes.
Yeah.
So those relationships and interconnections within a system are ultimately more important than the individual components themselves.
Right. It's how those things interact.